Hello, everyone. I'm Brittany from Frog God Games, and today we're talking about the inspiration, background, and setting of the Northlands Saga with author Ken Spencer. Ken, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Doing good. Why don't you start by telling us about the project and kind of how it was creating the project, like what your inspiration was for it?
Okay. This is a reboot, maybe not so much a director's cut, more likely, of our Northlands Saga. Northlands Saga began as an idea in 2010. I took it to Gen Con that year and shopped around to various publishers, and Frog God Games was interested in it. And we did the first adventure, two adventures, 2010, 2011. The original Northland Saga began sort of in the middle of the story. And we have an opportunity now that we want to reinvigorate and do it a little differently. I've learned a bit in the past 13 years as an author and as a project manager and developer, and to bring it into new systems. So we are starting at the beginning with Spring Rites, which is an introductory adventure. Your heroes are young Hearthguard who are trying to make a good impression on their Jarl so that they can be taken into his household and have a place in life. And they are given a very simple mission that spirals rapidly out of control.
I love that. So, from the names, I gather that it's based probably on Northern European folklore.
It's Northland Saga is a fantasy inspired by the history, mythology, and stories of the Norse, of the Viking era. I
Ooh.
drew from history, I drew from archaeology, but I also drew very heavily from the sagas, the Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda, the various historical sagas, especially the sagas of the Icelanders and Greenlanders, and also from traditional fantasy. So it's not a historical game, it's a historically inspired game.
Ooh, okay. So I would assume you probably have a great love of that general mythology
Oh,
and
yes.
genre. Um, what first piqued your interest in old Northern European mythology, history, etc.?
Oh, well, I've always had a fascination in history. I went to school to study archaeology and worked in archaeology for many, many years. But what really drew me into the Viking Age was, oddly enough, my father and his interest in early Mississippian and later Mississippian archaeology and Native Americans. And he, from far as I can think back, has been fascinated by the fact that while the Mississippian civilization was close to its peak, was the same time that the Norse were founding a colony in Vinland and Newfoundland. Lonso Meadows is the archaeological site there. And he always wondered, was there any contact between those two great civilizations? And for me, that drew me into an interest in, well, who are these people? And that snowballed. I'm a big historical war gamer, and it's a wonderful era to play historical war games in and to collect models. If you can see my miniature collection in the closet behind me, on the top shelf is my longship. Um, so painting, collecting, that leads directly into, if you want the colors of the tunics and the shields to be right, you need to read a history book. If you read the history book, you see a reference to one of the sagas. So you read that saga. Well, that saga is connected to this other saga. And before you know it, you're writing a role-playing game based on your studies.
I love seeing historically inspired fantasy work because, you already have this culture that's so rich in detail that you're basing it off of. And then the fantasy world creates this entire new culture. So the mythology and the depth of the product I find always is just so much more rich, and there's a lot more to dig into. And so I'm excited to see this project come to fruition.
Plus, it's very hard to come up with a name for your character. And if you have a list of names like we have in the Player's Guide to the Northlands, then you've got a table right there to roll on.
Yeah.
And we don't end up with Plucky the Halfling.
You don't end up with Asher the gnome.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, that's great. So you said it starts in spring. Is
Yes.
this series of adventures, or this particular adventure, this world, do they break things up into seasons?
Throughout the adventure path, there are adventures that have to take place in certain seasons, but
Mm.
weather is an important part of it. The adventure path is called the Lord of Ice and Cold. It's about the demon lord Althunak, who wishes to coat the world in an eternal winter. He was defeated centuries ago, millennia ago, actually, by a band of heroes, and is now starting to regain his power. And our heroes encounter him time and again, his minions, and eventually, by the end of it, they have to save the Northlands by defeating Althunak, who has returned to the mortal realm.
Oh, okay.
Not in the first adventure, though.
Of course not. But but overarching plot is always good to get into. This is so cool. I love Viking mythology. I'm not very well versed in it, as you can tell, but I love learning about it.
It's like I said, it's long been a fascination for me. I don't speak any Norwegian languages. All of my language study in college was Romance and Semitic languages. Um, so I've had to guess a bit with Northland Saga, and my ongoing fear is that trying to build some of the names of places, that there's something there that a Norwegian speaker is going to read and be like, "Oh, that's horrible. You can't put that on a map."
Oh, I think it'll be fine. For our viewers watching, please cut us some slack. We're Americans. I hear that always goes over well.
That always goes over well. Exactly. Exactly. I only know Spanish, a little bit of French, and some German, and a tad of Arabic. So,
But hey, I think it's the love of the culture and also the love of
mhm,
like the world you're building that really comes through when you do these
exactly.
projects.
And speaking of Arabic, I just recently finished the book of Ibn Fadlan. Do you remember the movie The 13th Warrior with Antonio Banderas?
Very vaguely.
Well,
Um,
it's the book that inspired, it's the actual historical book that inspired that movie.
oh wow.
So the book is a person who traveled from Baghdad up into Russia and met the Rus, who are an offshoot of the Nordic cultures. Uh,
Oh,
yeah, and his experiences with them and with some of the Turkic peoples in the region, um, and then it went on, and there were several other within this anthology. There were several other Arabic writers who were writing histories and geographies of their time, and fascinating stuff. Um, Talk of descriptions of a Viking raid all the way into Spain, which is something we don't think of. We think it's the British Isles, maybe parts of France, but they reached as far as Spain and as far as into the Black Sea.
oh wow.
So
They were a
plenty of
very,
fodder for adventure writing there.
oh yeah. So are there any, I mean, I'm sure there are, but are there any historical Easter eggs or little things that literary or historical fanatics will
Oh,
pick up
tons.
on?
I use a lot of what's called a keening, which is in Norse, also in Anglo-Saxon. Um, it's a poetic phrase that is a metaphor. It's usually one or two words. The prime example is the ocean is referred to as the whale road.
Hmm,
So I use those throughout. In the player's guide to the Northlands, there's a list of what the keenings are, the most commonly used
nice.
ones, so that our players, our GMs can go, okay, this is what he's talking about. When he says the spear den, he's talking about battle, that sort of thing. Sif's hair is gold. So there's a lot
Okay.
of that in there. I use both the Norse and the Old Germanic terms for the deities somewhat interchangeably within it. Mostly the Old Germanic terms, because with Marvel, if you hear, oh, my character worships Thor, then everyone's going to Chris Hemsworth.
Exactly.
Which is fine. That's great. But that breaks a little bit of the feel of the adventure. So I use Donar, which is more of a Southern, older Germanic term for the same deity.
And that's a very creative way to get around certain preconceived notions that people might have going into it. Because as soon as you hear Northern European mythology and Vikings, people do tend to think of the more Hemsworthian um, look of it
Exactly,
all.
exactly.
So,
But if that's what you want at your table, just use Thor. They're interchangeable within the setting. One of the speaking of things, um, there's a historically there was the concept of the Thing, Thing, which is a local gathering of all free people who would then discuss issues and vote. Even they did trials that way. So that's in Northland Saga because I think it's great to have the Thing and the All Thing, but it's spelled Thing. So when we first did Northland Saga 13 years ago, a reviewer commented that calling the Democratic Assemblage a thing seems somewhat uncreative. And we had to correct them that actually, no, that's the historical term. It just happens to be related to an English word.
so you know what? Know your history before you critique people.
Exactly.
And I mean, these were people from the almost 1,000 years ago, if not
And
more.
more, exactly. I
Yeah.
generally 1066 is often held as the cutoff for the end of the height of the Viking Age.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
yeah, well, that saw the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which defeated the Danish army and ended their invasion of England.
Oh, wow.
They
Okay.
continued to ravage parts of the British Isles and parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia, as well as explore into North America. But that's generally held as being that's the point, that's the high point, and after that it's a decline and then a change, an evolution into a culture that's more similar to the rest of medieval Europe.
So, if you would like an archaeological, historical, and literary take on Northern European mythology, then feel free to check out on our Indiegogo The Northlands Saga by Frog God Games. Thank you, Ken, and we look forward to seeing you next time.